10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5.
Good afternoon, everybody. Those of you that are live or who will catch this later, it's Patrick. This is my office. Welcome to an experiment, an opportunity to interact with you on matters of relevance, whether they have to do with a sermon or something else that's coming our way. Thanks for joining in. I know there's a lot of things you could be doing with your time during lunch, and I hope this could be fruitful for us all. Certainly, it's something that's been tried by any number of people, and whether it's a gimmick or something of great merit to us in the future, time will tell based upon your feedback. So anyway, thanks for coming. Thanks for listening in. Thanks for those of you that have submitted questions. We'll just see how it goes, and hopefully others of you will submit questions in the future. Why are we doing this? We think it's a great way to interact with what material is coming out on a Sunday morning. Sermons are, by definition, in a modern world, rather a remarkable thing in that it's just one person up front sharing all that they know from based upon a text that they've studied. And in any other setting, there's usually opportunity for interaction and engagement, and we thought that this medium would be a way to do that. So we recognize that there's a lot of information that comes down the pike when it comes to any given sermon, and there's all sorts of questions that might arise from them. And so here's one vehicle through which we might do that. So I'm going to actually put the questions up that I've received. Don't worry, any of you that submitted them, it will be done so anonymously. But I think it's a good way for us all to see not only to get answers to our questions, but to see what other people are asking, because it's not uncommon for one person to be asking a question that happens to be on the minds of several other people. So here's our attempt. It's one big experiment. I hope that the technical side of it retains and keeps up. If there's anything at any point that any of you that are watching where you're not hearing something right or the screen goes black, put a note there in the chat, because I'm able to monitor what people are seeing or commenting on in real time, and we'll just see how it goes. And so let's break in. In terms of questions, we got, we'll call them 5 sets of different questions, and they come from various places, not only in the background of what's going on in the letter of James, but also some of the deep theological issues that we find that James raises. And certainly if there was any text that created its opportunity for questions and controversy, it's what we heard in chapter 2, verses 14 through 26. So the first question that I'll just post up here is what you see in, let's see if I can get this right. We'll do the transition right. Someone writes, do we know how long James had been a pastor to this church? How long had they been believers? What beliefs were they struggling with that James had to write this letter to them to spell things out? Let me start with that part of their question, and then we'll get back to the other part in just a moment. What do we know about James? How do we know that who is this James? The person that's writing from the letter only describes themselves as James. And if you look in the New Testament, there are 3 candidates for who this James might be, one of which is James and John, the brothers, the sons of thunder, the sons of Zebedee. It's that James that ends up getting killed as a consequence of his faith. There's also among the disciples James the Lesser, What an unfortunate way to be described and to be known of across all of history, is that you were the lesser of the two. Sometimes you wish you could write above your name, but that's just how it comes down to us. And then there's the third James, the James that we find out to be the half-brother of Jesus, who ends up becoming one of the head apostles. You see him prominently at work in Acts chapter 15 as one of the lead apostles, one of the lead presbyters of the Jerusalem Council. If you only have James, the letter, to go on, you don't have much to go on to identify who this James might be. And so we really are having to rely on church tradition about those who knew the background of these letters and who ended up probably commenting later on what ended up forming the Bible as we know it. Interesting tidbit, no one in early church history until maybe the 3rd century was even quoting this letter. So Origen, one of the early church fathers, he was one of the first theologians of the early church that began to reference James. And so it's based upon those like Origen and others that lead us to believe that the James of this letter is the one who's the head of the Jerusalem Council. So it's hard to know whether he had any say in planting the churches. Again, he's centered in Jerusalem. These churches are most likely fledgling Jewish Christian churches in what we now know as Syria, as we've talked about when we began the series. So he's not the one to have planted them, but they are the churches to have formed. It's most likely that they formed around the synagogues of that day in those places. So it's unlikely that he himself went into those places, but there was a great deal of conversation and letters going back and forth to give a status report on what was going on there. So how long have they been believers? It's also hard to say. It's probably a few years, several years perhaps. As you know, the church begins in Jerusalem, and it's only until the church undergoes a pretty stiff form of persecution that those churches, that believers get sort of thrown out from Jerusalem, and in some ways, one way or the other, fulfilling what was anticipated in Acts chapter 1 about going to Judea and Samaria and to the farthest ends of the earth. So how it gets to Syria, hundreds of miles away, I don't know how long it took, but nevertheless, it was going to be some years from the point after which Jesus is risen and ascends to his rightful place that those churches were formed. When it comes to the beliefs that they're struggling with, you kind of have to go on the basis of the text itself to discern what are the crises that those churches are facing. And as we said in the very first week of the series, you can tell that those churches are undergoing a great deal of trial, whether it's from without or as we've come to see in recent weeks, there's a lot of trial coming from within, a great deal of disunity, of controversy, of treating others within the body in ways contrary to what it means to be part of the body. So you rely a lot on what you find in the text to understand what gave rise to James even writing the letter. You can certainly see in other places, in the book of Acts, for instance, where at the Jerusalem Council, there's any number of questions about what does it mean to be a Jew and yet now a follower of Jesus? And what compounds that problem is now what does it mean to have Gentiles to be considered on equal standing with those who are Jews? For these people that no longer or never were given the law, how do we consider them as equal to those who were given the law, who God had made his contribution to, his oracles, given his oracles unto, and blessed with prophecy over time? So any number of questions that these fledgling churches were having to grapple with, and there in the wake of the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15, you see them sending out letters to a number of people, to a number of those churches, trying to nail down what are the essential elements of belief in Jesus that would apply both to Jew and Gentile alike, so that things can proceed with unity. Those are sort of the things that James is facing and James is writing into. But if we just take even the last couple of weeks of what we've considered, these early churches are apparently not knowing what it means to be a body. What it means to be those who are not only shared of having a shared belief in Jesus as risen from the dead and as Lord over all things and as Savior of those who would come to him for refuge, but what does it mean to get along? What does it mean to share what does it mean to live for one another's good and not just one another's or just one our own selves survival and thriving. So those are the sorts of things that they're facing that James is writing into. Let me go back to the question here just so we can see. Let me transition back that way if I can. Yep, that's not it. Let's go back. Well, let me just read that part of the question that mattered. And the part of the question that I didn't get to show you last time is, how do I know the Holy Spirit is the one working in me to produce my good works? I can feel very good about my goodness and then realize I'm forgetting my good works are like filthy rags. So how do I let the fact that I have Jesus' righteousness already credited to me spur me on to love and good deeds today? It's a brilliant question. It gets to the very heart of what that passage we were considering last Sunday about. How do I know that the Spirit is working in me to produce good works? It's an important question because, as we said towards the end of the sermon, motives can always be in play, and they can always be mixed in whole sorts of ways, and we can be fooled into thinking that what we're doing is precisely what he means, what he intends. I think one way to adjudicate or assess whether what we're doing is indeed in accordance with his will is what's being produced in me as I seek to walk in his way. What's happening in me that I might grapple with, or that I might assess whether or not it's genuinely motivated by the right things. And there's always the perfect fallback position is, what is the fruit of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Those aspects of character, that virtue, that while it is multifaceted, is still one, and that's why Paul calls it the fruit of the Spirit and not the fruits of the Spirit. That aspect of character is always a good indication that the Spirit is at work in what we're doing. Whereas we can be walking in all sorts of commandments. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments, Jesus is saying. But if all that produces in us is dread or bitterness or anger or a begrudging spirit, then one might humbly acknowledge that there is something else at work apart from what he intends, and it's certainly not of the Spirit, because if the Spirit is at work in what we do, in these works that proceed from faith in Jesus' work, then it will be the fruit of the Spirit that bears testimony, that's manifest in what we do. So one good way to know is the Spirit at work is what's being produced in me in the course of me acting in those good works. It is true. There's all sorts of things that we can do that we can really be impressed with what we're doing. So impressed that we end up looking down on others who are not doing what we're doing. And when that happens, you also know that something else is animating or propelling what you're doing other than the humility that's engendered by the Spirit that calls us to action at certain times, that indeed, as the author of Hebrews says, spurs us on to love and good action. And that word spur is certainly something worth hanging with every once in a while, because a horse will go when it wants to go, but sometimes when it needs to go, it has to be spurred. And that's why I think the author of Hebrews chooses that word, because there are plenty of instances in which I really don't want to do what I know I need to do. And I don't think it's necessarily counterposed or opposed to being led by the Spirit or being motivated by the Spirit when you have to do something that maybe in the moment doesn't feel like something you really want to do, but you know you need to. And that's kind of the way love works. That's kind of the way Jim Gaffigan did his thing in that clip you saw at the beginning of last week's sermon. I'm sure there were plenty of moments in which he hated the idea of trying to clean out his wife's trach that can get crusty and nasty, but if he doesn't do it, she can't breathe. And so I think the Spirit spurs us on to do good things, spurs us on in love to do those things, but because it sometimes requires spurring, it does sometimes require something more than maybe what great exuberance or enthusiasm for the moment calls forth from us. So how do I let Jesus' righteousness spur me on? I think it may come down to a very important distinction between two subtleties. the idea of seeking to please God and the idea of trying to prove something to God. I was just talking with one parishioner this morning about that distinction. And to be sure, as we've heard from something that Paul said a while back, we make it our aim to please God. That there's no sense in which we don't want to please him. If we're indeed delighted to know that we've been made a son or a daughter of God, then we want to please him. But to please God is not the same thing as trying to prove something to him. And to borrow maybe a more familiar and very this worldly idea, when it comes to our parents, sometimes we really want to please them. And then there are other times where we feel like we're trying to prove something to them. And I think even in the moment, sometimes we aren't even aware that maybe what we thought was just trying to please them is actually trying to prove something to them, to prove our worth to them. And I don't believe that God is ever wanting us to try to prove our worth to him. That worth is already secure in what Jesus has done. And it's because of that worth that we become confident of, that we then seek to please him, but not try to prove our worth to him. And I think as we think through in real time kind of what's in the middle of that, there are plenty of moments in our human interactions where we think we're out to please them, but sometimes we're just trying to show them that we're important. And I think if we catch ourselves in the midst of trying to be in obedience to God, we can ask ourselves, am I just trying to please you because I delight to know that you have done for me what you did for me and your son? Or am I trying to do something that's a substitute for what your son did? Am I trying to prove a worth that actually has already been secure for me in what Jesus has done? So, I think it's a couple lines of inquiry and reflection that might help you to distinguish between being animated by something that it's not what he intends and being animated by something that he finds to be, really genuine and beautiful. So I think that's where we go on that one. Question 2. Let me go there. For whatever reason, it's not pulling that up. So let me try it one more way to see if I can. I'm not sure where my questions went. Anyway. Question number 2. Let me go back to that and see what's going on there. Question number 2 is this. Why do many believers get caught up in the theological debate, arguing amongst themselves, throwing shade or throwing tomatoes if they had them at the presenter of the word, and not prioritizing Jesus' exhortation simply to go and preach, to go and feed, to go and heal, to go and make disciples, to go and love, to go and be fishers of men? Go and remember me as you're going about. Why do we like debate? Why did I even reference that debate somewhere in the sermon? And I think, why do we get caught up in debates? Because people love controversy. How about the last few weeks as one more testimony to the fact that we all love controversy and that we're glued to whatever media we have to follow that controversy. We love it. And surely the text that we heard in chapter 2, verses 14 through 26, on its face, what feels like it's a shot across the bow of Paul's claim that we're saved by faith alone. James makes it pretty explicit when he says we're saved not by faith alone, but by the works done in faith. Well, those sound like, again, on its face, as two contradictory messages. And people love a fight. That's why kids wander to the recess line at the bike rack and watch the two people duke it out, because they love the kind of conflict. And these texts provide that kind of fodder for that. And especially when it comes to Scripture, because everybody loves to be able to kick it to the curb and say, look, see, it's controversial or it's contradictory, so why are we listening to it at all? If it's full of contradictions, then how can we say it is of divine inspiration, etc.? So I think those are sort of the human impulses that drive why there's a controversy to it. Why do we as Christians get hung up on it? Because at one level, not only does it live at this very abstract level of theological debate, but if we think about it, it can grip us with a great deal of fear based upon how we come down on how to bring those two comments from Paul or from James or Jesus and us all. How do we reckon with all of that? It can be rather disconcerting to think, I need to really respond in a way that shows that I really mean it, that I've really been impressed by what God has done for me, and that there's this sense in which I've got to fill up my tank with all sorts of good works, and then at the time that I come to God in the hour of my reckoning, I show him this, and he looks it over, and he thinks, yeah, good enough, you're in. That's a very different way of thinking what obedience is about or what it's for than being told, what Christ has done for you is absolutely enough. You're blessed. You're his. You're forgiven. You're united. You're secure. You're rescued. You have an inheritance that cannot be taken. Those are two potentially very different ways of thinking about how we order our lives and how we're animated and motivated, that if we don't reckon with that properly, well, then that can be just a very different way existentially to think about life. And so I think that's why there's such a theological debate, because it reaches down into the very visceral understanding of what it means to be alive, what it means to prioritize, what it means to love. The second part of this person's question is, does focusing on this debate stall the Great Commission as well as the commandments mentioned therein in the text? Can it stall? Can the debate end up obscuring the point? No doubt. And that's why we devoted some time in that sermon, as you would have to in any exegesis of this passage. You got to devote some time to working through the controversy to show that James and Paul, like one commentator said, they're using the same vocabulary, but they're not using the same dictionary. They're not coming at that word justification with the exact same lexical meaning, with the exact same definition meaning as each of them are. And so, yes, it can stall, it can obscure, it can bog us all down. And yet, if we don't address the controversy, if we don't listen to what James means by it, justification, if we don't listen to what Paul means by it, I think we don't have the fuel we need to persevere in the Great Commission and in the Great Commandment. We can't just sort of leave the controversy to the side, because it's actually by working through the controversy that we come to realize what was, I think, the thesis of the passage and the thesis of the sermon, and that is you've got to keep faith in what Jesus has done and love in the way that Jesus has loved together, because it's faith that drives us unto those loving works, but it's those loving works that depend on knowing what Jesus has done in order to be sustained in those works. So we need to hear the controversy, we need to assess the controversy, we need to work through the controversy so that in fact we can be prepared for following in that Great Commission to, as he says, go and preach, go and feed, go and heal, go and make disciples, go and love. It's necessary, and so we do, and so we will. So that's essentially where we are there. So let's move on to question 3. If you're all still with me, thanks for staying with me. Thanks for not getting bogged down. I think the technical side of it is still working here. So anyway, question number 3 says, stand by. Wait just a minute. Someone's at the door. Who could it be? It's our pastor of worship and arts, Ben Seneker. Ben.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Welcome.
Heidi ho, neighbor.
Heidi ho.
Mm-hmm.
Say hello.
Hello.
Play us
everyone.
something, will you?
Can I sit here?
Sure.
Am I still?
This is the commercial break for your entertainment.
I think I know that one. Should I go on?
When you hear banjos, keep paddling.
Faster.
Go.
I actually don't know anymore.
That's all he knows. You know, it's good that I'm glad we brought him here today. He's play us something on the banjo. Go. Brilliant. Let's give it up for Ben. Ben, thank you very much for joining us.
Does anyone have any questions about the banjo?
Any questions for Ben? No? Okay. Great.
Well,
Ben, thanks very much.
Yeah, okay.
Have a great day. See you later.
Howdy ho.
We like to keep it light around here. It is such a heavy time to talk about that. So anyway, moving on to question 3, which for whatever reason you can't pull it up. I don't understand why. I'm sorry. One of those technical difficulties we'll have to iron out as time goes on. Question number 3. How can salvation be not of works when faith is required? Isn't believing a work? Aha. Work, faith, salvation, every single one of those crucial words. And yet, what we need is a definition. And when it comes to works, to kind of refresh our memories about where we were on the sermon on Sunday, when it comes to works, and Paul saying we are not justified by works, whereas James says we are justified by works, remember the distinction that we found in 2 different meanings, 2 different nuances of the word justified. If works do not justify, when Paul means our works do not justify, he means our works, no matter how beautiful or how blessed, can ever establish or make a case for why God should be obliged to receive us and allow us to belong unto him and to forgive us of our sin and unite us to all of his good work. There's nothing in us or through us or by us that can establish that case. And to justify is at some moments to establish something, to make a case, to justify one's existence, you will sometimes hear say, where you are doing something, providing a way, and it's by what you do that justifies your existence, that allows you to have a reason for being that attains to some mode or expectation, and therefore creates that place for you. That's how Paul is defining justification. And we would say that no work can do that, because no work can. Even though James references both Abraham and Rahab as those who are demonstrating works that flow from their faith, if you'll just listen to the rest of Abraham's story, we know plenty of moments in his story in which he acted faithlessly. And therefore, the question is, does somehow what he did with Isaac overshadow or outweigh anything else that Abraham did that reflected a lack of faith? James isn't going there because he doesn't need to, and that's because he's using the idea of works and justification in a different sense, in that it is to justify, that it bears testimony to. It proves out. It doesn't prove the worth of someone. It doesn't make a case for them, but it does bear testimony. It bears witness to the reality of what is true inside of them. And so those are the different ways in which both Paul and James uses the word justified in relationship to works. But there's always helpful to go back to Jesus, right? When in doubt, consider the king, right? And what do we learn from Jesus in John chapter 6 when he talks about when someone comes to him and they say, what are the works of God? What must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says the works of God are to believe in the one he has sent. That's it. That's the work of God. To believe that Jesus, in fact, does proceed from him, and therefore to walk in his way. And so to believe in Jesus is to act on the works that God calls from us, and to believe in him is there to love him, because if you're believing in him, you're loving what he did for you, and if you're loving what he did for you, then you're keeping the commands that he called you to do. So we get kind of caught in abstractions when we say believing and working and faith and salvation. Those all have meanings, but as we work things out in reality, a belief in Jesus necessarily, as we kind of centered the sermon on Sunday, belief yields, belief is the consequence of having Jesus having made an impression on you, and the kind of impression he makes is one that proceeds, or that fruit proceeds from that, work proceeds from that. So it's not the work that obliges God to bring you in, to forgive you, to unite you to himself, but it is that work that bears testimony to what God has done in you. So the famous formulation that some attribute it to Calvin, some attribute it to Melanchthon, some attribute it to one of the reformers, but that you are saved by faith alone, but saving faith is never alone. You're saved by faith alone, but saving faith is never alone. If you want to put it in very relational terms, think of any friendship you have, any marriage that you know of, kind of like what we used from Jim and Jeannie Gaffigan. There was something outside of your control that brought you together, that united your hearts in love to one another, and that was something that it has a certain mysterious quality to it, and yet, in conjunction with that new relationship and bond that is formed between you, something happens such that now you feel a certain responsibility and ownership of one another, that you work for the advantage of one another. The only thing that distinguishes that kind of love and obedience between two people when it comes to God is that God doesn't need us. He's not added to by us. But he is certainly pleased by what we do when we answer in love to him, because his love is this constant steady thing that does not change, as James speaks of in chapter 1, verse 17. So that's question 3. Let's see if we can find question 4. Otherwise, I'll just read it to you again. Here's question 4. How are we able to do the works James is speaking of in our humanness? Are we always going to do it right? And if not, what does that mean? Here's the simple answer to that important question. Are we always going to do it right? No. There you are. Free of charge. No extra charge for that answer. Why I say that is I give thanks that the New Testament would include the experience of the disciples in its narrative. Because if there were any bunch of hapless folks that are trying to figure it out and who show forth just how foolish they are and how much they're not getting, it's them. And are they doing it right at all times? The better question is, are they doing it right at any time in most of what Jesus is out to tell them? And why Jesus, we find, is often exasperated with him and others for the number of ways in which they demonstrate an exercise in missing the point. That's their gig. That's what they do. And so are we always going to do it right? No. And thankfully so, we see that in the disciples, who were even at some point, James, the other James, who's the brother of John, comes up to Jesus in 2 different accounts of the gospel. One of those accounts includes their mother speaking on their behalf, saying, hey, would you let these boys be on your cabinet when you come into your kingdom? What's that all about? They're looking to get cabinet level positions. They're a quid pro quo. We'll do our thing. Will you do our thing? And so are we going to do it right all the time? No. And in a lot of times we're going to be motivated by an effort to prove something to God because we don't believe that Jesus is enough, instead of just trying to please him. And I'd like to say we may maintain this constant perseverance in that effort. And yet, if we're more honest with ourselves, it goes in a lot of different ways, and that's why we have to come back to it. One of a favorite song of mine is by a songwriter down in Atlanta whose name is Alan Levi. He's an attorney, but he's also a folk singer, and he has a song called Refrigerator Art. And he speaks of that which we do for God is not so different from what kids do for their parents. And what do their parents do? As soon as the kids bring home that stuff from school, they tack it up on the refrigerator with magnets. And usually that which ends up on the refrigerator is not something that's going to show its way into the Met or in the Louvre. It's just stuff that they know was offered in love and which a mother or father is most pleased to put on display. And it's the theme of that song that God is like that he takes our work and treats it like refrigerator art. And sometimes in the chorus, Alan Levi sings that God is both the collector of refrigerator art and he is the perfecter of refrigerator art. It's what he does. It's what he loves to do, because most of the time that which we bring unto him is without symmetry, and it's a bad color scheme. And maybe we did it with a great deal of anger that we need to be repentant of in the midst of whatever we were doing. And that's how God receives it, but is pleased to display it because it demonstrates our love unto him, even though it is often mixed with a lot of our own humanity that can easily obscure the greater purpose for which we give ourselves unto his work. Okay, last question, which I appreciated with a great deal because it demonstrates a lot of humility and honesty about where things are coming from here. But this person writes, all this talk about works in last week's sermon made me tired. But the scripture wasn't about rest, it was about work. Both Abraham, who was called a friend of God, and Rahab, the prostitute, who was Jesus's, the Messiah's great-great-great-grandson, are wonderful examples. Well, I just don't seem to find myself anywhere in between those two. If we were sitting in a bar named Skeptics and Cynics Pub, and I would love to challenge somebody to open an establishment by that name, how would you explain this to me in a way that I can understand it, like that Tylenol video clip? Is there something in all this about being willing to serve, i.e. works, and having to submit by faith, and to who? And to what do I submit? Is there autonomy in that in such a way that I'm free to search and to try and to practice working out my faith? I love the honesty of that question because I think it reflects the heart of many of us. I know it reflects my heart more often than I maybe care to admit. What do we do when the call to faith and the works that proceed from faith feel about as powerful as a sneeze, and therefore not much to it? Where do we go? How do we know? How do we discover and kind of, as Paul says, work out our salvation with fear and trembling? There's a passage that I've gravitated toward for many years. It's in John chapter 7, where people are beginning to come to Jesus and they're beginning to question his authority and ask him, why does he feel like he can speak with such authority? And he says, look, if anyone wants to do God's will, he's going to know if the teaching that I bring is from God himself or it's just of my own authority. In other words, he's saying, test me. Test what I'm saying. Do what I do. And there may be something that is yielded in the process of trying to do what I do. And I think maybe if we understand that kind of comment in the whole context of the New Testament, there are moments in which if we try to walk in Jesus' way, we will see a real power in it. To be able to turn the other cheek, to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, to acknowledge the humanity in everyone, no matter how inhumanely they may be treating you, you come to worship and you know that somebody has something against you. It says, don't even kid yourself that what you're doing is worship until you lay that gift there, you go and be reconciled with your brother, and then come back and offer your gift. All of that stuff is profound, that if we sit with it long enough, we go, there's power there. There's something to that. There's a wisdom that is not of this world. And I think Jesus is saying, try me, and you will discover something really beautiful and glorious about it. And yet at the same time, I think we'll discover, kind of like Benjamin Franklin did when he began to track himself, when he would practice one virtue a week and discover that he would fail every single week at any given virtue he wanted to give his attention to, that when Jesus would say, go do what I do, we're all going to find it's too high. The bar's too high. What he expects of us is beyond the pale. And I think it's proper for us to discover as skeptics and sometimes, if not more times, cynical, that there may be something beautiful to it, but there may also be something rather impossible about it. And there's a book I've referenced in the past. It's a book by a guy named Francis Spufford. He's a British author. He goes in some directions that I wouldn't go, but he goes in a lot of directions that I find rather captivating. And in his chapter entitled Yeshua, he does, I think, one of the most wonderfully poetic capsulizations of who Jesus is and his story, of the beauty of what he does. And he speaks of nuances and details about Jesus' life that are spoken with such great glory and beauty that I commend it to you. There's certainly some threads that Spufford goes down to describe Jesus' priority that I wouldn't go, but there's a lot of it that I go, it's just beautiful. And when at one point halfway through the chapter, Spufford speaks of Jesus in this way. Jesus talks as if virtue is almost unachievable, yet still compulsory. Rather than being a menu of demands that all can satisfy, for him it seems to be something that it would take feats of absurd unlikelihood to accomplish, rents or openings or transformations in the order of nature so that camels can climb through needles' eyes. So even Spufford himself recognizes that Jesus speaks of this bar that to us just seems impossible, and yet Jesus doesn't back off. He says, look, if you must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And so how do we sort through that? How do we go there? Later in his description of who Jesus is, and especially the point at which Spufford transitions to talking about the beauty of Jesus and himself on the cross. Just listen to how Spuffer describes Jesus from the cross as if Jesus were speaking himself. Jesus saying this from the cross: "I am the Father who longs for every last one of his children. I am the friend who will never leave you. I am the light behind the darkness. I am the shining your shame cannot extinguish. I am the ghost of love in the torture chamber. I am change and hope. I am the refining fire. I am the door where you thought there was only one wall. I am what comes after deserving. I am the earth that drinks up the bloodstain. I am gift without cost. I am, I am, I am. Before the foundations of the world, I am." And there from the cross, he says, the pain fills him up, displaces thought, as much for him as it has for everyone else who has ever been stuck to one of these horrible contrivances, or for anyone else who dies in pain from any of the world's grim arsenal of possibilities. And yet he goes on taking in. It is not what he does, it is what he is. He is all open door to sorrow, suffering, guilt, despair, horror, everything that cannot be escaped, and he does not even try to escape it. He turns to meet it and claims it all as his own. This is mine now, he is saying. On that count, what's the very practical way of thinking through what James 2 says? And like that letter, or like that commercial we saw of Jeannie and Jim Gaffigan, you have to go back to the story of Jesus. You have to consider the way in which Jesus thinks of us and the lengths to which he goes on our behalf. And if there is a way that I could, again, capture what feels like a real beautiful way of understanding what Jesus has done, and the way in which he speaks of not only his beauty, but of his glory, of how he's operated on our behalf, totally without cost to us and totally at great cost to himself. I think the most beautiful thing we could think of is, let me see if I can show you this clip that I've got.
Don't just stand there. How do I get off?
Just happen to have a slam bang finish, sir. Yes, sir.
We'll follow the old man wherever he wants to go, as long as he wants to go, opposite to the foe.
Wait.
Stay with the old man wherever.
I should set that up. Technical difficulties. It's going to work. Hang on a second. This is from White Christmas, if you don't know what that's talking about. And what's happening in that moment is early in the film, Danny Kaye and Bing Crosby are soldiers who have served in this platoon, and their general, their sergeant, is about to be transferred to another body. And they're putting on a Christmas play because it's right before Christmas. And in that moment, in this scene, which is actually replayed later in the song, you hear these men speak of their commanding officer with such glory and appreciation. Just listen to the words as best you can, and I hope it's going to work this time, even though I shut it off.
Don't just stand there. How do I get off?
Just happen to have a slam bang finish, sir. Yes, sir.
We'll follow the old man wherever he wants to go, as long as he wants to go, opposite to the foe. We'll stay with the old man wherever he wants to stay, as long as he stays away from the battle's fray. Because we love him, and especially when he keeps us on the wall. And we'll tell the kiddies we answer duty's call, with the grandest son of a soldier of them all. Stay with the old man wherever he wants to stay, as long as he stays away from the battle's fray. Because we love him, and especially when he keeps us on the ball. And we'll tell the kiddies we answer duty's call, with the grandest son of a soldier of them all.
That scene continually comes to mind when I think about what does it mean to want to follow in his way, that Jesus himself is our king. So a commanding officer is certainly a good analogy to understand how we are in submission over one who is rightly over us. But by the words alone from that song, you hear that they will go wherever he wants to go, in whatever battle that he calls them to. And why? Because they love him. They certainly respect him. They don't want to cross him. They don't want to offend him. But to say that why they do what they do is anything less than love is to misunderstand the moment. And it's that very same song that you see at the end of a White Christmas that underscores the truth of that form of motivation. And I think if you wanted to come up with another analogy for what it is to see faith working through love, or that the works that proceed from faith, how do you know that you love him? By keeping his commands. But why are we to keep his commandments? Because we love him. And surely there are moments when what we're called upon to do maybe is the last thing we feel like doing, and it's only by doing it it's only by starting to do it that we remember why he is worth doing it for. And life is full of too many examples of what it means to walk in love, when in the moment, well, it feels more like maybe a little bit of, I'll just do it because I know I'm supposed to. And we are all familiar with that, with friends, with neighbors, with spouses, whatever it takes. We do that because love does that. And it is because Jesus is our king, but a king who is loved, and who has loved us like no king ever has or ever will, that we'll follow the old person wherever he wants to go, the one who is timeless and who is eternal. Okay, that's several questions, and we spent about 45 minutes going there with even a commercial interruption with a little bit of entertainment. So I'm hoping that this was helpful to those of you that are watching, and for those of you who pick this up later, I would really welcome feedback on whether you think this is a fruitful line of interaction. We'll see what comes back and determine whether this is a good use of other people's time and good use of my time. I know I'm enjoying doing it, but I hope that you're blessed. I hope that we can continue this in some form or fashion. In subsequent weeks, should we continue to do this, you can send in your questions to that email we showed on Sunday. It's called followupgrace@gmail.com. And depending on your responses, we'll see if we continue this. So grateful for your time. I hope that your lunch was fruitful. And let me see if I can lead us out this way. Peace be with you. Later.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6.